With schools set to reopen next week, concerns are mounting over the number of unqualified and underqualified teachers at independent schools. The Network for Educator Effectiveness and the Foundation for Education and the Social Justice Africa report a rise in complaints, while NAPTOSA highlights legislation that prevents the disclosure of a teacher's qualifications. Executive Director Basil Manuel now joins us to have this conversation. Basil, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. How widespread is this?
Aldrin, good morning and thanks for having me. Aldrin, there are different types of private schools or independent schools as we know them, but we know that they have mushroomed over the last couple of years. And reports are sporadic. We are trying to determine the exact extent, but it does appear as though it is pretty common that either under or unqualified, and even more scary, student teachers are being lured into coming to do teaching jobs, obviously at a lower rate than what your qualified teacher would do. So we are worried about that, and particularly because of the quality of learning and teaching in these schools.
Yeah, and what does the legislation say about this?
First of all, we have the SACE Act. And in terms of SACE, you have to be registered with SACE to be able to teach, whether it's in an independent school or a public school. And of course, if you are underqualified or if you're a student teacher, you cannot be registered simply because you must meet the minimum requirement in terms of qualification. Now, there are historical people that may be underqualified that were initially registered, but I would imagine many of those have gone through the system already. So employing a teacher that is not registered with SACE is in itself breaking the law. And we want schools to give account to parents, but we also want SACE to start dealing with these schools and bringing it to their attention, not only the attention, but also giving them a cautionary note about this employment practice. It shouldn't be happening.
It shouldn't be happening, but how is it allowed to happen? And in terms of monitoring, whose duty and responsibility is it to ensure that only those who are qualified and who have the SACE certificate are actually teaching?
Given the sheer number of teachers that there are, we are talking about in excess of 500,000 teachers in the entire education system. It is virtually impossible to check on every school. So we depend on the principals, we depend on the governing bodies or the governors of a school to ensure that they follow the law. But ultimately it lies with SACE also to ensure that there isn't a breaking of the very SACE Act. And that is why we are calling on SACE to put into action plans so that there's better monitoring, particularly in areas where it is identified as a problem.
Yeah, and here's the other thing, though. If we take into consideration, especially with the independent schools, and think of them as businesses, these are businesses that always go through the annual audits, the audit runs that need to take place. Shouldn't that also be included as part of the audit check to see whether they only have qualified teachers in front of pupils?
That is one way. The other way also is for parents who are paying fees, and some of them are pretty high fees, certainly much higher than your public schools, where there are many no-fee schools. And if you're paying a fee, you have a right to demand that the people that are providing the education service are qualified. Whilst you can't hand out people's qualifications willy-nilly, we have the POPI Act, you can assure people, and the principal's responsibility and the governor's responsibility is to assure people. And if they lie, we can hold them to account.
Is it known what the penalty is for a teacher who is unqualified or underqualified, doesn't have the SACE certificate, to stand in front of students and teach students, what that penalty is, if there's any?
There's no penalty, but it lies with the governors and the principals of these schools to do the right thing. And certainly there can be issues with SACE and with the registration of the school if it doesn't have the requisite qualified people. And that is why we are calling firstly on the schools to come forward especially, Aldrin, when you consider that there are many qualified teachers that are not employed at this stage. It's not as though there's a shortage of qualified teachers. There are sufficient. So there's no need to have to put people there, and especially student teachers who should only be in a school teaching under the guidance of a qualified teacher. That is why they are student teachers. So it's absolutely unacceptable to have these categories of people being deliberately brought into schools and being allowed to teach.
Yeah, and isn't that the problem then, that if you don't have any penalties meted out against those that don't follow the regulations of SACE, now speaking about the underqualified or unqualified teacher, because they bear responsibility as well, because otherwise there's a misrepresentation. The parents are under the impression that the person who's in front of their children are actually qualified to do the job, so bringing criminal cases against them.
You see, Alden, we've always believed that self-regulation should be the better one as opposed to the big stick. But I think there is a place for a big stick too, particularly if there's a flagrant disregard for the rules that are in place. And this is something that we will pick up with SACE in the year coming, so that we can have a solution to a problem, because the problem is persisting and it's been around for a little while.
Yeah. Could one of the other reasons be that the reason that we are seeing this is because the schools that operate as a business want to also make sure that they bring down their budgets when it comes to the allocation for salaries, and getting an underqualified or unqualified teacher to stand in front of children would mean that you at least can pay them less?
I would imagine that that is the major motivator. It's a business. You bring down costs, you pay people less, and that makes perfect sense. But at what cost? Because the real cost lies with the quality that you are delivering, and of course, what you are giving to these children and the story you tell parents. So the losers are the parents and the children, and not the school.
Yeah. Do we know about the extent of this in the public sector, though, if at all?
In public schools, provinces cannot employ underqualified people. They must first have a SACE certificate, and you can't have a SACE certificate.
That also applies to the private sector, right?
Yes, but in the public schools, it is actually mandatory that the certificate be attached to an application, and that is where it has been controlled. So if there are opportunities within your public schools, it is very, very few. And it would have to be with a reason such as there's absolutely no teacher of this subject that can be recruited in this area. But I will guarantee you that in the public schools, it's a very minimal problem.
Yeah, and I know that you stressed this point about legislation around the Protection of Personal Information Act. But considering that, for instance, in public schools, you have an obligation to attach your SACE certificate to the employment application, don't you think that that should also apply to the private sector?
It ought to. And you see, when you are giving information to your employer, you're not breaking any law. But the employer can't publish that information. That is the point that I was making earlier on about a call that said we need to see if these people are qualified. The principals must guarantee this. You can't publish that information. But I agree. Upon application, there must be a SACE certificate so that we can get rid of this problem. We have qualified teachers. Let's use the resources we have before we lose them, Aldrin, to other countries. And people get tired of not being employed and they start looking further afield. And you can't blame them.
Thank you so much for your time. Basil Manuel, who is the Executive Director of NAPTOSA. This is following a report of an increased number of underqualified or unqualified teachers